Now we are able to output our dummy data here, but setting that data from inside Power BI, that is not working. That is not something we support yet. Instead, we just have the dummy data. Now, of course, I want to make sure that we actually allow the user to attach data here in Power BI, and we render that data here instead of our dummy data. And for that, we now need this capabilities.json file, because this in the end allows us to define which kind of inputs we want to accept, and then it acts like a, you could say, translation between Power BI and our code. Now here is what we show to the user, and currently we're allowing for some category and some measure data. That is why when you click on your visual, you'll see category data and measure data here. So you can change the text that is displayed here, and here we could, for example, say categories, and here simply values. Now it's totally up to you what you enter here for the display names. If you save that and you reload your visual, you'll see that this was adjusted. We can also configure the internal name we're going to use. And here I'll stick to category, but I'm going to change this here to value. And the kinds should stay what they are. There are certain kinds of data you can use, and indeed categories here should be grouping data, whereas this is measure data. Basically, your values are the measures, so the things that are displayed in the chart, and your categories are the groups, so basically the content that ends up in the legend and that defines how many bars are rendered, for example. Now, here in your data view mappings, you should reflect the names you have up there. So if you have category here, you should have category here. And if you change this here from measure to value, you should also change it down there to value to reflect that name. This is needed so that the data correctly arrives in your code. Speaking of that, let's go back to the visual.ts file, because now we can actually work with our own data. Therefore, we can delete this dummy data array. Let's delete it here. And we do receive that data the user added in the update method, which, as you learned, runs whenever the data changes. So in here, we can now extract that data. And for that, I'll add a new constant here, extracted data. And that extracted data here will be an empty array initially. So just square brackets, nothing in there. But now we can reach out to our options here, and there we got this data views thing, this data views array as it turns out to be. And from there, we can basically extract our categories and our values. For that, on data views, we have to access the first element, which we do by passing a 0 between square brackets here. This is a special notation in JavaScript, which basically gets access to the first element in this data views array, which we are getting from Power BI service. Now, this first element will have a categorical property, because in capabilities.json, this here is named categorical. And that in turn will hold information about the categories and the values defined by the user. Hence, I will store this in a new constant here, categorical data. And we can now extract the category by accessing the categorical data and then dot categories and there the first element. And we can extract the value by accessing categorical data values and then the first element. Now important, this does not mean that we just extract the first data point passed in by the user. Instead, if we have a look at our capabilities file again, we see that categories and values in the end are specified here, and they just hold information about the different value sets and category sets the user might have provided. Now we're going to make sure that only one set of values and categories can be provided here, but theoretically you could build visuals that accept multiple categories. So for example, countries and regions in those countries, or countries and time spans, and that also accept multiple types of values. We're building a simple visual here where only one type of category and only one type of value is accepted, and therefore we retrieve only the first type of category and only the first type of values here. And what we retrieve here then will indeed be arrays full of all the categories for that type of categories and all the values for that first type of values. That is how you have to think about that. Therefore, of course, we should make sure that not more than one piece of data can be passed. And therefore, back at capabilities.json, here in data view mappings, next to categorical, so inside of this object here, we want to add conditions. And this allows us to specify some conditions for the data the user may provide. And there we pass in an object with curly braces, where we define that for the category, we only, by passing another object here, we only want to have one category at max. Now here I'm using the schema language that is supported in the capabilities.json file to find all the possible conditions and all the possible settings you can configure there. The official docs are the place to go. I'm doing this here for a category, and I'll then repeat it for the measure. There I also set this to max 1. And this ensures that only one kind of measure, one kind of value, and one kind of category can be provided. And this, of course, should not be measure, but value, because I renamed it to value up there. So value and category. So with that, I'm restricting the user input, and that makes sure that when I extract the first value, I do not miss any data the user might have provided in addition. And now that we know which kind of data and category we want to work with, we can extract the concrete data points. For that, we can write a so-called for loop, which allows us to repeat code. And in the parentheses here, we write let I equals 0, which basically means we're creating a new variable, which unlike a constant is allowed to change, where we can reassign a new value with the equal sign. And we initialize it to be 0. And we then add a semicolon, and then comes our condition, how long this loop should continue running. And that is that I should be shorter than category.values. So these are the concrete category values. So things like China, Germany, and so on. So the values provided for categories. So the category names, if you want to call it like this. .length. This gives us the amount of categories the user provided, so the amount of data points we got for categories. And in our case, we'll always have a similar amount of category data points as we have for values for those categories. And then we add 1 to I, and this is a shortcut for doing this, after every loop iteration. So this will basically go through all the category values we received, so through all the countries we received, for example. And now we go to our extracted data, which is this array here. And we push a new data point into our extracted data. Now that should be an object, and that should be an object where we have a category, like we had it before in our dummy data. Here we retrieved category from it. And that should be our category values for index I. And I is changing with every iteration. So in every iteration, I is incremented by 1. So with that, we extract all the country names step by step and push them in new objects to the extracted data. But of course, we don't just want to push the category. We also want to push the value. And for that, we reach out to value, meaning this value. So maybe I rename it to data value to avoid confusion here. So here we reach out to data value dot values. So these are now the values for the different categories, for the different countries in our example. And there we also take the ith element to gradually pull out all the provided data and add it to extracted data. And now it's the extracted data which we want to use here in all the places where we used dummy data, because this is now the actual data we're working with. And with that, if we save that, and you also save the capabilities.json file, and we save all those files, back here, if we reload and we add data, we should see our sales by region. Once I added region as a category and sales for values. And make sure you map this correctly. Now let's verify if this makes sense. We can add a default bar chart, which is built into Power BI. And that looks quite similar to our custom bar chart. We have the highest bar first for China, and then it's gradually declining. And that's exactly what we got here. Now we are missing the colors, we are missing the labels, but generally that looks good. It looks like our data is being output correctly here. Of course, if we remove our data and we update our chart, this is all gone. However, what you notice is that it's not automatically removed if we remove data. If I remove my data here, the chart should of course update without me reloading it. And to make sure that this happens, we need to make sure that we don't just add new rectangles if the data changes, and we might need to add more, but that we also remove rectangles if the data changed and we are currently rendering too many. And for that, we reach out to bars again, but now instead of calling enter, we call exit, and this gives us information about all the bars that are on the screen but shouldn't be there. And we can simply call remove on those to remove them from the screen. However, what you'll notice is that still nothing is removed if I try to remove data. In addition, the resizing, by the way, also doesn't work, though we have all the logic in our code. We set the width and heights here and we try to remove elements. I can tell you that update will run whenever you add or remove data and whenever you resize. Still, our code doesn't seem to work. For the resizing, the problem is that we only set the width and the height and the position whenever new elements were rendered. So whenever new data entered our chart, so to say. And that's of course not the case for every resize. We already might have a rendered chart, and just because we resize doesn't change the data that's rendered. So just setting width and height if we got new data is wrong. So therefore we should directly call it on bars like this in a separate code block, so that it is independent from this entering code block. With that, resizing should work. Now, the removal of data doesn't work because our code here actually will crash, will not always work, because we try to always extract data, but especially if we remove data, of course, there is nothing to extract. And you can see this if you console log options data views here. Console log is a little helper statement we can use. And now if we go back here, you can open up your browser developer tools through the browser menu. And this gives you this developer console here, which you can use for debugging and for some messaging. And now watch what happens. If I reload my chart here, we see some yellow messages. We can ignore those. But in between, we see this array, which actually holds the data we received. And that looks good. We got our categories in there. And in there, we got our values, and these are the different values. Let me shrink this, which we received from the user. Now I'll clear the console. And in case you don't see the chart right now, just resize and it should be there. But now let's see what happens if I actually remove data. So I'm removing some sales here, and I'm removing the region. And we got one output here. And what we see is that in categorical, we got all that data, but whilst the categories field has data here, after I removed the values field is missing. Now, if you try to access something which isn't there, you will get an error, and that will crash the script, and therefore nothing will be rendered to the screen. So the fix here is that we first of all remove the log, and now that we add a if check here, and we check whether we want to run this code. And we only want to run this code where we try to extract data in the end, if we got data. So now here we add curly braces, put this code between the curly braces to run it conditionally and not always. And now between the parentheses here, we need to specify our condition. And that condition is that on options, we got data views, that this is set, and to join it with another condition, that on data views, we got a first element, because we're trying to access that, so it should be there. And on options data views, on that first element, which we verified is there, we have this categorical property. And I'll now split this into multiple lines to make this easier to read. Like this. Because now I also want to check that on options data views, on that categorical data, we got categories, and on options data views, on categorical we have values. And only if all these things exist, only then I want to run the code inside of the if statement. Only then we'll try to extract data, otherwise we won't. If we save that and reload, nothing is there because I haven't added any data. And once I do add data, it's still not there though. And that simply is related to how I changed this resizing code. The way this currently works out is that the bars I select here are empty initially when nothing is rendered yet. Then I add new bars when new data is detected, but then I try to set the width and height on my old bars. So on the bars I selected here, which was before I added them. So even though it looks to us humans as if we added them and then we set the width and height, I set the width and height on the selection I made before they were added. And therefore that doesn't work, and that's why we don't see anything on the screen. That's also why if you added data and you then resize, you do see something on the screen. Because now update runs again, now the bars do exist because they were added in the last update cycle, and now we just set width and height. Now of course that should all work in one go instead of requiring a resizing action, and therefore to ensure that it does always work, I'll simply grab that code and also add it here again, so that we set width and height when we add them, but also in subsequent updating cycles. And with that, if we now reload, with data added, it's there. If we remove data, it's gone. And now we can add it and remove it, and we can resize it, and that all works. So this is great. This now works the way it should, finally. Now let's make sure that we of course also have different colors and labels and so on, so that this is a more realistic chart.